Hello. Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. It's actually my second time in this hotel. First time I came for vacation. For people who actually do want to have a copy of my slides, here is a QR tag. You can flash it, and you can also type it. Okay, here in this directory you can find a copy of my slides. So, just a few introductory remarks. For me, computational making is something that's quite new. The title of my talk is Computational Thinking and Making, and I actually looked at the Italian translation, which is much better. The Italian translation says that my talk will be about computational thinking and computational making. And that's actually a better idea, but I had that while I was preparing the talk. So I have been practicing computational making for some time, but I'm not a researcher in the area. So what I did for you is I looked at the whole literature, tried to find all the interesting articles and sort of extract the most important ideas, and then I will present you also some environments that you as a teacher can actually use. Okay? So let me start with a few definitions. First, so making in American English is an abbreviation for digital design and fabrication. And you have that in industry, but now you also have it at home and in schools. So here are a few very popular things, like this is a 3D printer, very cheap now. You can have one for 300 euros. Software is free. But they have the disadvantage, they may be unhealthy for your students, and they're very, very, very slow. And at the opposite, well, not exactly the opposite, you have expensive laser cutters. These are the most popular instruments in so-called fab labs, because they are fast, precise, and easy to use, but they're also sort of dangerous and very noisy and very smelly also. And you got vinyl cutting, and for that is really cheap, works well, but unfortunately you can't do very spectacular things with it. And of course, I have seen that in previous slides, you also work lots with electronic boards, and of course if you program these boards, you do, for instance, variable things, then we also talk about making. My favorite board is Adafruit CPX because you can do electronics without understanding any electronics. One of the big problems you have in making, if you give it to engineers to teach, they want to teach engineering, lots of things at the same time. And most often, actually, normal kids, they can't follow everything. And the last thing is computerized embroidery. I like that a lot because it's working technology, and it's also environment friendly. Instead of throwing away a sweater, here was a hole before. Okay, I just put some embroidery in it. So you can do upcycling. Do not forget that textile is much more important than robotics for your industry. If you go to Italy, you buy clothes. You don't buy robots. Okay, so it's also quite interesting. And so the workflow in making is fairly simple. I mean, this is a simplified workflow. You start with an idea, then you either draw or you program a design with a computer. And then this design needs to be parameterized for 3D printing, embroidery, or whatever. It's all the same thing, okay? And you produce a machine file, and then a machine uses it to fabricate, or if it's an electronic board, it uses it to interact with people, and then you can use it. That's the idea of how workflow works in making. Now, in education, how is making actually used? I identified 3 use cases. You can produce learning objects. For instance, this is an island that's to the south of you. And so this is a 3D model that you can use in a class to explain risks on volcano. You can also produce objects that can be manipulated, put together. And so learners would learn by manipulating physical objects. You know all Maria Montessori, for instance, you know, she has that kind of materials. And Finally, you can use it in education, and that's what I heard today mostly. You give things to build to your students, and they learn through building things. Now I have exactly the same slide, to repeat my message. You have basically two situations: the teacher or someone else. Okay, you can also buy stuff. Creates objects that learners then use in a learning activity. And you can teach all sorts of things using this medium: disciplinary things, transversal stuff, digital design. And you can, of course, also teach computational thinking, ICT literature. And so I'm going to focus in my talk on this area here, which is learners create objects and learn in the process, and they learn some ICT stuff, including computational thinking. So third slide that repeats the same message. You can use making in education for all sorts of purposes. You can use making to build tools for language learning, science learning, math learning. That's not the topic of my talk today, or not much at least. You can teach transversal skills. Some other speakers mentioned that. For instance, you can teach students how to do projects, how to collaborate, how to acquire cultural competence, how to do physicalization or whatever. Okay, so the goal there is that you use it as a medium for so-called 21st century skills. And I find it quite interesting. I don't know if you're aware of this DigiComp thing. That's the European standard for ICT literature. I would say 5% is computer science, and 95% is just being able to talk, to communicate, to be smart in a certain way, okay? So nowadays, if you talk about computational thinking, you also talk about things that are around computational thinking. And making is a good medium to develop those things, including digital design, of course. Now, let me give you a definition of computational thinking. It's a set of knowledge, attitudes, and skills that help you solve problems with principles from computer science. Okay? It's not necessarily computer science, because in many areas people are now using computational tools that have been developed in computer science. So it includes formulating a broader issue. You have to be able to identify a problem or something that needs some sort of computational solution. Then you solve it. You create a solution using ICT. And there you really have sort of two aspects. One is learning applying computer science principles like decomposing, abstracting, defining, and so forth. That's the kind of thing that is taught in programming. But this is also very important. You have to be able to find installed software, draw, manipulate images, parameterize, typically things that computer scientists cannot do. And normal people can't do that either, unfortunately. So, both now, computational thinking and making, they have something in common. And this something in common can be called design thinking. You have to be careful with that term. Design thinking is now used and abused by many people. And it's just another word for Scandinavian user-centered design. There is no difference between that. It's just a new way of saying that if you want to use the computer to get something done, especially a weakly defined problem, you should emphasize with the problem, think about it, and at some point be able to define what you want to do or what doesn't work. Then you have to come up with ideas, build a prototype, test the prototype, and then when you test it, you can have new ideas and finally develop a product. Okay, this is just some sort of agile development methodology, but that is now being sold as design thinking, whether you like it or not, okay? Now, I conclude my definitions with a definition of computational making. For me, computational making is computational thinking, so some stuff that comes from computer science and some that comes from use of ICT. It includes, of course, digital design, because the idea in making is that you really make something, and computer-controlled fabrication. So you also need a machine that does that produces your design. And the advantage of computational making as opposed to other digital ways of designing things is that you can do precise stuff, you can automate repetitive tasks, you can do stuff that allows for parameterization. You can build something and give it to users, and users can just change parameters and you get different variants of the same thing. And also, algorithm actually can produce unique and fun stuff. And that's a message that comes mostly from people who use computational making in the fashion industry or also as artists. Now, my questions are the following. Can we teach computational thinking through making? What environments and activities work? And the third question is it effective and efficient? I don't have answers for the third one, actually. So, let me now explain a few theoretical foundations for learning with things. The idea is very old. Like a previous speaker said, you know, most ideas, Donald Clark is not here, I think. Ideas are fairly old. Okay, yeah. Now here you have the most important people who are interested in learning with things in the history. Starts, you know, you have Locke, you have Rousseau, and so forth. You have one Italian lady here, the only lady, by the way. And so a first strand is learning by manipulating and constructing. I cannot go through the whole tree, or we will finish by 4 o'clock. But the most important idea that came out of this line of thought that started with Rousseau is constructionism. That's what you do, for instance, in educational robotics, or if you teach programming with an environment like Scratch. Okay? So you have children play with a hands-on interaction. They use a kit. That a kit can be something on the computer, or also can be something physical like Lego. And this kit actually has a basic set of elements and operations. You can put things together in different ways. And these kits are ready for exploration. You know, as soon as you light up your Scratch, or as soon as you open your Lego box, you can start doing things, putting stuff together, and see what happens. A second very influential theoretical strand of thought is the idea that learning takes place in a social, up here, in a social and cultural, I cannot draw over this. The mouse doesn't like my pad here. Yeah, here, so we go. Okay, the learning takes place in a social, cultural, and material context. So the idea is that as soon as you play with objects that are made, these objects, they carry culture. And these objects are also used in a cultural context, okay? And so I don't know if you're familiar with socio-constructivist ideas. I mean, Barbara was talking about Vygotskian proximal zone and so forth. It's all the same idea, that learning is basically acquisition of cultural practice with objects and other instruments that have been produced by a culture. The third one, influence which is very strong in educational making, of course, is project-oriented learning. You also have several influences. I can go back to the history. Apparently it started in the Renaissance, but at least in the American world, Anglo-Saxon world, I would say the most cited person is Dewey. An education and a person and philosopher who invented probably guided learner-centered pedagogy. So he had the idea that you should give real projects to students, but nevertheless scaffold them very much. So add some structure to it. It's not free exploration. You do have other influences like the French Freinet or the Brazilian Freire, who insisted much more on the idea that one should develop learner autonomy, so something that goes back to Rousseau also. So you have a strong contrast in project-oriented learning between structured one and sort of that one that is more open. But the idea in both is that you actually do stuff that has a link with real world. And that constructionism does not have, okay? I mean, Scratch is outside of the real world. Now, I'm trying to put these things together. Okay, it's something that I call neo-constructionism. For me, neo-constructionism is a combination of microworlds. That's what you do in educational robotics, totally disconnected from the real world, whatever the discourse says. Then you have project-oriented learning, including a scaffolded learning. You have activity-based learning. So the idea is that students are active and work with objects that have some cultural meaning. And then also comes the idea of learner autonomy and identity. This is very important in making. See, if you give a project to make to a student, the student normally has to come up with an idea, do something that is meaningful, even if it's something as stupid as, let's say, embroidery. You know, if you do an embroidery patch, of course you can tell the students what to do, but usually you let them do it, and they will produce something that is actually helpful for them, and once they have done it, they're proud. So they develop some autonomy and identity. Okay? So that's what I see in the making movement in education. Now let's have a look at some faces again. If you go and analyze the literature, there are about 50 research papers that I found. That means that maybe there are maybe 100 total. Half of the authors or more are women. It's very different from traditional educational theory, which is basically based on dead white men. Okay, so these women these are actually interesting careers that you can see here. Most are computer science. Started doing computer science, but they all acquired a second or third competence. For instance, this one invented sort of the main variable board, Lillipad, and she now is a computer science and making professor. This one was the boss of the whole team at MIT Media Lab, and she does computational fashion and art. This one does creative coding. This one created a multi-million company. This one also. This is a German researcher, and they actually all try to look into computational making. So this is for the teachers now. If you want to start doing computational making, that means creating objects by programming or similar technology. You can look at BlocksCAD. That's a Scratch-like language. This code to the left here, okay? Well, this mouse is really not very, I don't know what's going on. Produces a sort of plastic thing that you can stick here. And the object, of course, is not very interesting per se, but it allows children to understand loops. Okay, loops are very difficult to explain concepts in programming. It also teaches that actually when you do something, you should have a general solution. Here you have parameters. You can change lots of things. You know, you can make it smaller, bigger, more. You can have more arms, 2 arms, 3 arms, 10 arms, whatever, and it will generate the solution. So this is this object here. Okay. Now you can do something similar. This is not the same type of programming. This is so-called turtle graphics or turtle computing. But with this environment, you can create embroidery, and it does work. I mean, I made this flower, and on one of my embroidery machines, I did embroider that. So it's an environment that really works. Oh, by the way, I forgot. Okay. If you're used to Tinkercad, some of you may teach 3D printing to students. So in Tinkercad, there is an option where you can actually program instead of drawing. I like this environment better, but if you're used to Tinkercad, you can just use the so-called code blocks to do it. Okay? Now, there's something different that's not meant for children, and I don't understand really how it works. is what I call nodes programming. I don't even know if this is the right term. So instead of programming like a computer programmer would do, you just connect various nodes that are sort of filters that transform data. And this thing on top allows you to produce this, okay? So you can use this in advanced mathematics class, okay? This is not something for primary school students, okay? This is last degree of high school or maybe last degrees of a master's degree in mathematics. And the software is free. It works with a free Blender drawing program. If you have lots of money, you can also take Grasshopper. That's a Rhino extension. So Grasshopper is free, but Rhino is very expensive. And finally, of course, you can do digital electronics. Digital electronics is a little bit difficult because, as I said before, if you're going to teach engineering, you cannot pretend that you teach computer science because it's too complicated. You know, if you teach engineering, you have to teach how to build objects. You have to teach electronics, and there's lots of things to learn at the same time. That is fine for an introduction to engineering, but it's probably much too much for an introductory class into computational thinking. But nowadays, there are some boards that actually can be programmed in an easy way. So this is a Scratch-like code. You know, you also can program them with JavaScript, or if you want, really, you can program them with Arduino. But for beginners, can quite quickly do something. So this is, I made a test in one of my classes. So one of my students programmed sort of something that would measure the temperature. So she tested it with her child, put it on the balcony, and after a while the thing goes blue because the child is cold. Then she put the child inside with additional clothes, and then after a while the child grows hot, and so the thing goes hot also. And you can do that fairly easily. It's about, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 lines of code, 5 minutes, okay. The last thing, this has nothing to do with computer science, but as I said before, computational thinking also means that you're able to use your computer. There is some open source software for embroidery, which is called Inkstitch. It's very difficult to install because you have to be able to unzip a file in a directory. Most people are unable to do that. And but after they managed, actually, they learned something about how using their computer. They also will learn lots about drawing. Most people cannot use a drawing program neither because it's not taught in school. So features of these making environments, they mostly include visual languages that include all standard elements you need to teach computer science. Someone else, an expert says that, not me, okay? You can export to symbolic languages to go further. There is support for sharing code, and of course you can directly produce machine-readable code so that the machine then can produce your object. And let me skip that. So I have looked at the research. I found about 50 publications, and all these publications can be qualified as initial research. That means it works in one context and probably will not work in another context. I mean, that's typical of educational technology. So what you can see in these publications is that students who create things and learn some computer science principles at the same time, they are motivated. They have a feeling of self-efficacy, which is quite good for learning. They also produce stuff that's useful, which also helps, especially that now schools are told to buy 3D printers and you don't know what to do with it. So you can use them to teach programming, you know, because otherwise they're rather useless. Children will just download objects and print them and produce some more plastic waste. And then there is the German contribution. There is a German word which is called Bildung. Bildung basically means deep learning. Basically means that you learn things, that you control yourself, that is usable, applicable, and that you understand. Now, just last but not least, a short word about teacher making. So you as teacher can also make objects. I mentioned that in the beginning. And why should you do that? In case you want to teach making to pupils, you should actually use it for yourself. That's the only way of understanding the process and of having some pleasure in learning something. You know, if you don't want to use it for yourself, you will have trouble doing it with your students. And you can do lots of fun stuff. For instance, you can create tools to teach programming that don't need a computer, so-called unplugged programming. This is a tool that some of my students did, and you can, it helps teaching instructions and procedures and procedure calls. These are just two concepts, but it's two interesting concepts. And then there is a whole lot of things you can actually create, like molecules, how they fit together. This is the island of Vulcano I already shown. That was used actually in a course on risk management given to the children of the island. You can invent languages to talk to autistic people. You can use Lego bricks plus your own to manage your projects. You can create tools to learn languages, letters, or you can also create tools for group management, classroom management, and so forth. Okay? And there are some examples. One of my students actually gave 2 free laser cutting classes to teachers. The classes were full in one day, and all the teachers, they produced interesting instruments themselves that they were going to use in a class, but I don't have yet data for that. And so that went pretty well. You can go and look at the projects. Everything that we do is in the open, so you don't have to worry about that. And of course, you can also use things for group work, brainstorming, and so forth. As instead of post-its, it's more fun to stick things together than to do post-its, but it's the same idea. So let me conclude. I think that digital design and manufacturing has the potential to improve pedagogies, and that includes computational thinking, because they add authenticity, graspability, that's a constructionist argument, self-efficacy, and also some structure. And then I have some things that need to be further explored, but I will spare you that. And maybe there's time for one question.